We can see how that's led to defeat and disempowerment and disenfranchisement everywhere we look. And today we're seeing the next offensive in Greece, most obviously, of the neoliberal project. And this has got nothing to do, as I'm sure you all know, with Greek laziness or any of that rubbish. It's about an economic system which tends towards inequality. And the more it's left to its own devices, the more inequality grows. Well, I'm guessing that we all in this room know that it doesn't have to be this way, that there are solutions out there. But as I said, I think the reason people aren't hearing them loudly is because we as campaigners are still thinking about how to make the medicine a little bit less bitter. How we make sure that some of the scraps are from the overflowing table of the rich are apportioned out as fairly as possible. And I think that's understandable, as Caroline said, when defeats have built up over the last 3 decades. But it's got to change, because at this time, more than any other, people are desperate to be told about real solutions. And in international development, just as I think here in Europe, essentially that means calling for people to retake control of the financial system. Yes, through a... Partly, as Caroline says, that means a Tobin tax. Partly governments being able to exercise control of money coming in and out of their economies. Outlawing speculation on essential commodities. Nationalising strategic financial institutions. Creating an international debt court to prevent creditors being able to squeeze the last drop of blood from their debtors. And then, of course, we as international campaigners need to connect that story with the lives of people here in the UK. And there's never been a better time to do it, because people know how unfair and unjust the financial system is. People know that what happened in Africa yesterday and is happening in Greece today will happen here tomorrow. But despite that, we haven't managed to break through this standard analysis that cuts are essential and necessary. There's barely a mention of the possibility of taxing the richest as a way of getting us out of this crisis. And that leaves people despairing. People are left despairing, and there's only one way out of that, overcoming this despair, and that, I think, is solidarity, is joining together in one movement to fight for a very different vision of society, of the economy, and of the world. Now, last year, a few of us tried to do this. We set up a coalition called Put People First, of trade unions, of international campaigners, environmental groups, and faith groups as well. And it was an unprecedented coalition, fighting to ensure ordinary people don't pick up the tab for the greed and recklessness of the few, but also to create this new financial narrative, this new story. And we had a few successes. We had a big demonstration in London, we had a couple of counter-conferences, we had some media stunts, all nice stuff. But to me, that was the beginning, because the really exciting thing was the conversations, the challenging conversations we had to have with our own activists, and trade unionists had to have with their own activists, about why we were working with these other activists that had slightly different interests from our own. And I think these conversations, this building of trust between different constituencies, are the absolute bedrock of building a movement capable of changing the fundamental problems with our economic system and indeed our society. And we made a start, but really the experiment was cut short, because some of the bigger supporters, including in my own sector, were moving into uncomfortable territory here, away from the bite-sized, soundbite size campaign actions that they're comfortable with, away from campaigning as a form of marketing, away from change being essentially about sitting in a room and trying to convince some politicians and civil servants. The unbelievable caution that we all know exists in so many of the institutions of civil society today. Well, I suggest we learn from others. We learn from social movements, for example, in Latin America, who have successfully fought off privatizations, trade liberalizations, militarization of their society. Trade unions and NGOs and community organizations who have gone beyond simply protecting their members, beyond sending out some postcards and going to a lobbying meeting and asking you to vote for such and such a party. As important as those things may be, they have gone beyond that to become focal points for a fight back against economic austerity, against making the poor pay for the sins of the rich. Social movements who have ensured today the election of some of the most radical governments in the world, and then instead of sitting back and allowing them to get on with it, have held them every step of the way to account. Because politicians, with a few noble exceptions, are only ever as good as the movement which is pushing them. That's why Franklin Delano Roosevelt Franklin Delano Roosevelt told his party activists after his election in 1933, "I agree with you. I want to do it. Now make me do it." He understood the notion of power, and we need to understand it too. And what are these governments who've been elected now doing in Latin America? They are turning the economic rules on their head, creating trade rules based on solidarity and redistribution from rich to poor, rather than competition and sweatshop labour and redistribution from poor to rich. They are reclaiming strategic sectors of their economy to stop corporations draining their wealth year on year. They are overthrowing the chains of their debts. They're forming alternative development banks and currency unions to break the power of the US dollar, a power which still means the poorest parts of the world today are subsidizing the overconsumption of the richest. All manner of exciting, creative and innovative economic and financial policies to put people back in charge of their economy and their financial system. And even if you don't agree with every single one of the policies they're implementing, what we can all agree on is the re-empowerment and enfranchisement of the people that have made those policies possible. And that's something we so desperately need here today. The crisis isn't over. We can see that in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, and we can see the austerity cuts coming here as well. We are still confronted with an opportunity, I would say a responsibility, a huge responsibility on all of us, which is unprecedented in our lifetimes and which will not reappear for many decades. And to take this opportunity, we need to listen to our own rhetoric, to the banks and to governments. No more business as usual. That applies to us too. We have to change, to work with those we've not worked with before, and together to forward an agenda of radical change. No more sticking plaster solutions. And if we fail, look what's proposed right across Europe. The socialists in Greece about to embark on a massive privatization program. The socialists in Spain embarking on such cuts that even the financial markets think it's stupid. Hundreds of thousands forced out of work by public spending cuts in Hungary, in Romania, in Latvia, a worse depression than even the United States suffered in the early 1930s. We have to put an end now to this disastrous economic and financial experiment that has been going on far too long. The cost in people's lives and people's livelihoods is absolutely beyond comprehension. It's time to reclaim our economy, our democracy, and our humanity, and I hope we can do it together.
Thank you, Nick. Fantastic stuff. Christine Blower is the General Secretary of the National Union of Teachers. Christine and our union will be at the forefront of the fight against cuts. But just as importantly, perhaps more importantly, her union and others need to be at the forefront of creating the vision of the type of education system we want to bring in the kind of world we want. Christine, we're very pleased to have you here.
Neil, thank you very much. It's a delight and a pleasure, and I think a privilege probably to be able to speak to this audience here today. I reflected on the title of this conference, A New Hope, and I thought, am I being unduly optimistic in believing that actually there is a new hope abroad? But I think that by the end of this conference, we will have seen that there are a very great number of things that we can do together, notwithstanding the enormous cliff that Nick has just provided for us in terms of where we have to scale if we really are going to be talking about social justice and the kinds of things that Compass is really interested in. And I am heartened to be here today, and I congratulate Compass on organising this conference. The NUT, of course, is not an affiliated union. We have nothing to do with any of the parties, so we can speak openly and honestly about the last government and the new government, and we can espouse pluralism. And it's our responsibility to criticise and critique all parties in the way that some of you who are involved in education will be familiar with as a critical friend. So I can say a couple of very good things about the Labour government. You know, they did a lot on tackling poverty at home and abroad, and they did lift children out of poverty. And internationally, we're further forward on the Millennium Development Goal for education than we would have been had we not had the Labour government. But there are 72 million children who still don't go to school, and it's at least in part because of those kinds of policies that Nick talked about neoliberalism, that all of those children are being kept out of education. There are 5 years left until 2015 when the world leaders promise that all of those children would be in education. And the very single least thing that anybody in this room must do now is sign up to the One Goal campaign. It's not even asking for your money. It's just asking, as Nick says, to hold world leaders to account for the